Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So tonight, relatively smaller crowd. With me over this way is Mala Mahadevan. Hi, Mala.
Hello, good evening, everyone.
So Tom is in the process of moving. We've already bid him adieu, and we are, speaking of Tom, in the hunt for another board member. So if you're interested in joining the TriPass board, give me a shout out. You know various ways to reach out to me, and probably harpoon gun to my siding might be the best route, especially if you leave the harpoon gun. That'll definitely put you in better standing with me. So go ahead, do that, and we have a board position that we will announce pretty soon. Tom is still on the board. He's moving very soon, so we're waiting until that happens before we start shaking down the contestants. So Mala, I don't even remember if I said, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Kevin.
Glad to hear that. Tracy is also out for today. She might be out for a little while. Has a conflict at this point, like on Monday evenings, so we'll see. Anyhow, Shop Talk is chat-driven. We do questions and answers. Sometimes we give you real answers. Hopefully we give you real answers if you have real questions. Fake questions, who knows what we're going to give you. So we'll start off. I think there's going to be a question in chat, and I'm eagerly anticipating your question, Chris. Chris mentioned in comments before that there's a question about SQL Server upgrades with 2019 and things going sideways. And I did promise that we would at least talk about that tonight. Whether we give valid answers, hopefully we do. But if you do have questions, drop them in chat. If you want to say hello in chat, also go ahead and say hello in chat too. So while that's going on, let's talk about our first topic. How you doing, Mike? Good to see you. Talk about our first topic tonight, which is resource groups. This is kind of a interesting question in that if you come at this from working solely with Azure Web Services or with strictly on-premises servers, the idea of a resource group in Azure is not directly applicable. And there's a group that I'm on that had some discussion about resource groups. Actually, I had this conversation with one of my coworkers today about what is a resource group, because we're almost 100% AWS and on-premises. So Amazon doesn't have resource groups as such, and they you think of them as more in you work within subscriptions, and Azure has a slightly different mindset. Hi, VJ, good to see you. So the question was, what is the scope of a resource group? Do you have one resource group per application? And if you do, what if you have a huge number of applications? That feels a little weird. Mike as well was going to say I'm Mike 2, but I see Mike is up to 7 because I mixed a few tickets. Well, you're number 1 in our books, Mike. I'll let you guys figure out which Mike I was talking to. And Chris, welcome, connecting from Canada. Glad you're able to make it tonight. So, what does happen with resource groups when you have a lot of them? And let me take a step back and talk about some general philosophy. For me, I would say, look, a single resource group is going to be the set of things that you want to destroy when it's time to shut down that application or when it's time to decommission something. So essentially, it's your way of separating domains. Let's say, for example, you're building out a data warehouse. So you may have a lot of different resources tied to that data warehouse. You might have storage accounts for data lake storage. You may have, say, Azure Synapse Analytics. You might bring in Databricks. You may have Azure ML, possibly have Azure Data Factory, depending on how much functionality is not available yet in Synapse or what you're not doing in Synapse. You may then tie it into other resources like Power BI, but that's going to be a bit external. However, you might use Azure Analysis Services. So you may have a lot of different things that are clustered together. And the idea is, if you ever got rid of this data warehouse, you would want to dump all of that mess. And therefore, that could be a good resource group. By contrast, let's say you have a web application. Well, you'll have your web app itself. So that might be Azure App Services. You might have, say, Redis Cache. You may have a couple of other things that are tied to that application that are specific to that application. And if, for example, you have a Azure SQL database that is just for that application, that could fit into the same resource group. But you get to the question of domain separation. So, like I keep getting to, if this is all in the same domain, if this is all part of the same solution to the same problem, or if they're pieces of the same puzzle, then they could fit into a resource group, because that's a way of logically tying them together. And when it comes time to delete them, you delete them all at once, instead of having to figure out, well, this network group and this component and this component were all related to the same project. Because what will happen is you'll have a lot of storage accounts, network groups, you'll have IP addresses, you'll have VMs, things that you're not quite sure where they're used, and thus they sit there and keep running and costing you more money even after the project has been decommissioned. That's what a resource group is really intended to get to you. It's just a way of constraining together a bundle of different products within Azure and letting you crash them all at once. So, a couple issues in domain separation. If you have a service that goes across several applications, this can become troublesome. I mentioned app services. Well, if I'm using a, say, Azure Container Registry, and I've got containers, I could create one container registry per app service, and maybe that makes sense. But if I have a lot of applications, I might instead say I'd rather have one container registry where I put all of my images, and I can tag all of my images, and just have them be a central repo that I tie into Azure DevOps. Now, if I decommission one application, I have data inside my Azure container registry. I have those images that I've created, but will no longer be needed. And so that is where you get into some trickiness around the domain. Or a data warehouse might be used in several applications as a data source. So if I wouldn't want to put the data warehouse in one application, because or one resource group along with applications, because that would imply if I no longer need the application, I no longer need the data warehouse, and that may not be true. So next up, how independent are the applications? If you have a bunch of microservices, you probably can get away with one resource group per microservice app. And that way you can easily tear them down, bring them up, and you also enforce that separation, that principle of separation. For a proper microservice, you've got your application server or your application services, your container. You've got your data storage, whether that be Cosmos or SQL database or text files that are loaded into memory when the app starts up. And So that makes sense. But if you have some applications that are pretty tightly coupled together, it may make more sense to cluster them all into one resource group, with the idea being, well, if you have a bunch of applications that all use the same SQL Server VM to store data, you have a lot of cross-database queries. The applications tie into each other. They're dependent on the others for survival. In that case, it becomes obvious that, yeah, I do want this to be one resource group because everything is so bundled together. So before I continue on, got a couple questions. So Mike asks, does anyone have or work for an organization that bought SolarWinds and caught a sunburst? Or does anyone buy a single source security mechanism for their organization? Do you now worry that you've put all of your security eggs into one basket? Or more generally, supply chain bugs. So you're right, Mike, that is a big topic, but you know what? Let's talk about it. I do not work for an organization that bought SolarWinds. I know of people who have. I don't know if any of them have had any problems as a result of it, but
I know a couple of places I worked at, ex-employers had their network monitoring solely based on SolarWinds on Orion. Both of them, I talked to both of them some time ago. Both of them are happy with the support they got from SolarWinds. The patch was put in really quickly, and they had to stop the stuff when the news broke. But afterwards, they said that the company reached out to them and assured them that stuff has been patched and this won't happen again. So they are just proceeding like they used to. They seem to be happy about it.
Okay, well, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
And getting to the general problem of putting your security eggs into one basket, yeah, there's certainly a risk here. And essentially, you get to the paranoid security person who says any code is a risk, any integration with a third party is a risk, and it becomes basically the trade-off of what can we reasonably assume that the risks would look like, and how could we mitigate them as best as possible. And in many of those cases, that risk is that you've given too many permissions to the service, and we try to find ways to narrow that down. Now, for a security-specific tool, it may require some higher privileges than most tools. And I guess you get to who guards the guardians, who watches the watchmen. This is a classic problem in security, and it's not just on digital security; it's also physical. It's just security in general. That if you have a true zero trust environment, you're doing a lot of work that is potentially unnecessary in order to mitigate a risk that could be bad. And essentially it becomes a trade-off of how much effort am I willing to put into mitigating these risks. Like, for example, could I say log what this service is doing? Could I track using another tool what is happening with this tool? But then the question becomes, well, what happens if that tool is the one that's compromised? What if we build it ourselves? Well, internal developers aren't necessarily better than external developers.
Isn't that true? Yeah.
Yeah. They'll have bugs too. So Mike follows up, says, appears the malware sent had signed authentication, allowing it greater access within an intranet, and allowed it elevated permissions to destroy records of its attack. If you buy two supplier solutions, it seems that would be a double check on the single source. It could be a double check on the single source if you're resolutely monitoring the two and you've trained people up on the two and both of them are functional. It's I guess it's probably going to come down to what is the risk? What is the worst thing that, or not even the worst thing, what is the most likely scenario in the event of your security software being misappropriated? And determining what's the expected cost of that happening. And if that expected cost is high enough, okay, now we go do something else. Now we try to mitigate this risk. It's essentially it's an accounting problem, and this is part of why cybersecurity has often been inside the domain of the financial department, because a lot of this is following on practices that have been pretty common in finance for decades.
Uh-huh.
What happens if your accountants try to defraud your company? Well, we put in controls. We try to understand what is the possible risk. We put in controls to mitigate that risk, and we have processes which help understand whether our controls are in fact effective or not. And I think the story is still the same when you're talking about cybersecurity. When you're talking about even a process, something like SolarWinds. So Bruce Schneier says the same. Spend what you need to protect the value of what you're protecting. But, ooh, that's a pregnant pause right there. So while Mike is continuing to type up his counter, I'm certainly not the first person ever to come up with these ideas. Bruce has spent a lot more time thinking about it than I have, and Ross Anderson has spent a lot of time thinking about it. I could throw off a bunch of other people. Buy and forget is a likely scenario. Oh yeah. This is a problem, and within a company, that is a risk. It's basically trying to understand what those risks are, and the risk doesn't include the software that we bought. We just kind of forgot about it. We didn't even think about it, that VMware could have a bug, that SolarWinds could have a bug, that SQL Server could have a bug. There's actually a bug in SQL Server that's not currently known, or not currently public, the specifics of it are not currently public, but the latest CUs and GDRs. So, for example, SQL Server 2016, SP2, CU15 GDR, or CU5 GDR, whatever the latest version is. There's basically a security patch that just came out last Tuesday, so not even a week ago, that was about using an extended event, a particular extended event, that could allow for remote code to be executed. We don't know which extended event. We don't know what the process looks like. We don't know what the necessary setup is to exploit this. But the general idea here is that, yeah, there's a vulnerability, an active vulnerability in the product, upgrade to the latest CU. And as a security team, hopefully you've had that tabletop discussion beforehand. What happens if SQL Server has a major bug that is not our code, it's not our problem, but we have this vulnerability? What happens if Splunk has an issue where this information becomes public? And I guess I would say, as you get to larger organizations, this becomes more viable, this becomes more relevant, because when you're talking about an organization of 100 people or 200 people, essentially it's, well, we don't really have the time to sit down and table talk this, and to run through all of these scenarios, and to fill out all of the paperwork and documentation that a organization of 100,000 people would do. Where your security team is the sysadmin who has a full-time job as a sysadmin and also needs to do security because someone's got to do it. And you'll see risk in there. That's essentially, that's the company implicitly deciding that the risk of a breach is not very high, or at least the monetary value of a breach is fairly low. heard many of those hit by SolarWinds were U.S. federal, or by the bug, were U.S. federal agencies. Yes, that was. It looks currently, at least based off the last info I knew, that this was intended for federal agencies, and apparently several departments were impacted. That they looked back after the fact and were able to confirm that yes, there was a breach. I remember Treasury was one of them, and I think Commerce was the other one that I knew up front that admitted to a breach. And there were about a dozen other major agencies, including most of the TLA agencies, which may or may not have been breached, but won't tell us. The White House as well? Okay, so yeah, that might have been newer. But yeah, I guess that's the gist of it. Essentially, you're picking up a risk profile, and part of that risk profile as a security team is going to be what happens when your tools are untrustworthy, or how can your tools be misused in order to allow an intruder to gain access to something you want to prevent. It's certainly a viable scenario. We obviously saw it happen, and it's certainly a reasonable topic of discussion. And I think there are still ways that you could potentially mitigate it. That could include things like, working off of a whitelist of servers that a machine is allowed to hit. Well, if that machine is trying to reach out to another domain that's not something you would have expected, maybe that stops it. Constantly look for violations of least privilege. Yes. If you're in an organization that's large enough, actually, let me rephrase that. In principle, I am 100% in agreement, and to the extent that people are able to do so, it is a very smart idea. Where I have trouble is the practice, because when you think about the small company, the small company with a dozen developers is probably the easiest scenario to prevent violation of least privilege. If you have people who are dedicated and have the time to look for this stuff, in a lot of cases, you have people who just don't understand, or I need to get this out today because we have to do a customer demo tomorrow, and I'm getting permissions errors, so screw it, just give admin access and we'll figure it out later. Spoilers, you don't figure it out later. You just leave it. Giant organizations tend to have teams that focus on this stuff, but they also have so much code and so many developers that this kind of stuff sneaks in everywhere. Syslog or no log. Yeah. Sorry, Mala? Oh, I thought I was cutting you off.
Nothing. I just laughed.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so Mike says other. I don't want to say other Mike because that sounds like, lesser Mike. Neither of you are lesser Mikes. You're both great Mikes in my book. Syslog or no log. I would like to know what you're talking about in context there, Mike C.
I think he's referring to the SolarWinds tool,
okay.
But I may be wrong.
Okay, that's fair. I'm not too familiar with that. So while that's going on, got another question here. I'll get to your question in a moment, VJ. Chris says, my upgrade problem. SQL Server 2019 CU4 running on Windows 19 that had the server renamed. Yeah. The appropriate drop server name and add server name was run, but the registry wasn't changed to indicate the current server name. Running a CU8 upgrade, it threw an error probably because the server name didn't match what it was expecting. 574 error against MSDB 110 upgrade. So some upgrade script in there was throwing an error. 574 is not one I heard about before, but there's a lot of errors in this world. Master was not recoverable. Ooh. Had disk snapshots transferred to another server. Heard of using trace flag 902 to stop master from being upgraded. Yeah, that's a tricky one. Raised an incident with them, but don't think where I'm at has a contract with Microsoft. This is a production server. Did 2 non-prods, but they haven't been renamed. So, yeah, if the server's been renamed, now I don't think I've ever had that problem upgrading with a renamed server. But okay, have now changed the
Me
registry
neither.
key. Sorry, speak again, Mala.
I was saying I have not had that issue either. I do know that if I run into stuff like that, I'd probably have Microsoft on the call if I have to do that on a production server.
Yeah. Even if you don't have a
Yeah.
contract, there's yes,
Right.
it's basically, hey, I have to pay what, $250, $500, whatever for the call. If it's a
Mhm.
bug, they actually don't even charge you for it. So if you
Mhm.
call them up for a service problem and you don't have a contract with them, if it's a bug, essentially they refund the money of your call. So yeah, that offhand, you could try upgrading. I could see trying to rename it in the registry. Basically, set all the names everywhere. If you get server name from server properties, make sure that that matches what the new server name looks like. Add server name should match. Like, all of these different things should match. And if they all match, I guess you could try upgrading at that point and see if you still get the MSDB error. If you do, that's where I would definitely call Microsoft, because you're kind of at a point there where probably getting into a weird scenario. So, Chris, is that a VM or is it physical? Because if it's a VM, do you have the possibility of, instead of an in-place upgrade, just build a new 2019 box and migrate the databases over?
Right. That's what I was thinking too.
Okay, it
It
is a
could be.
VM.
Yeah.
So if you have that possibility of migrating over, that could also help, where you just install 2019 plain on the new VM and transfer the databases. Reattaching those databases, depending on what version you're starting from, probably, unless you're talking enormous databases like multi-terabyte databases, shouldn't take that long to upgrade the database. And that could also get you out of this problem if changing the value in the registry isn't enough. But yet, I know changing server names with SQL Server has always been a bit of a tricky situation, in that they tend not to like it very much. Helping at a university, so not sure about the costs. I would be shocked if the university didn't have a support contract with Microsoft. So Solomon asks, what's the error message and not just the number? Are you sure it's due to server rename? Good question. I was working off of the base assumption that it could have been, or that it was server name. But Solomon comes in with the troubleshooting wisdom. I do remember having a problem like this at one point, because we had created a VMware base image that had SQL Server pre-installed, and the base image had its own server name, and the way that VMware duplicated, or the way that we duplicated the images, was essentially like copy the server, and there'd be a second server with the same name, and they would rename the server in Windows. We had to stop doing that because SQL Server did not like it at all. So never tried to upgrade a renamed server, so it was new. Yeah, that's new to me as well. I don't recall if I've ever upgraded a renamed server. Generally, my philosophy has always been nuke it from orbit. That's the only way to be sure. But that might be because I got to see aliens again this weekend. So That may have just reinforced my internal biases. But yeah, if you're able to post the specific error message, if you still know what that was, that might be helpful as well. Rarely doing in-place upgrades without Microsoft support, says Mala. A lot of things can go wrong. It's true. It's true. I mean, up until now, it's a lot less true today. Because I think up until about, SQL Server 2014 or so, 2012, my recollection was that their recommendation essentially was don't upgrade, build new. And as of the last few versions of SQL Server, it was, go ahead and upgrade. It's okay. But I still like the idea of starting fresh and not having whatever cruft has built up over the last 5 years. Okay, script level upgrade for database master failed because SQL agent MSDB upgrade encountered an error. So in the install log, in the setup logs, there should be more information on the error itself. After error, you're going to see a little location for the log directory for upgrade.
Yeah.
And there will be some enormous text file in there that has 25,000 lines of diagnostic text that don't mean anything. And somewhere buried in there is the one line that says what the error actually is. Yeah, Mala says look in the Windows event logs as well. That's possible, depending on the specific error.
Right.
I've noticed on upgrade or install errors, it's better to look at that install log directory.
Fair enough.
A new server has only been around for a few months. Unfortunately, when we moved to a new server, the old server I did attempt the upgrade on was removed. Oh, that's a shame. Yeah. If there's any way to convince them that it would be better to just do a fresh installation and migrate the databases over, that might be the best route. We recovered using disk snapshots. Okay, you did mention that.
Yeah.
So that is a little unfortunate. And I guess, yeah, my best advice here is probably, can they install on a new VM? Can they do the dev work needed to migrate, change connection strings? And even if they can't, could you do the upgrade on a new machine? So install 2019 on a new VM, take a short downtime, migrate those databases over to the new machine, and then create a DNS entry that points the old server name to the new machine until they change their connection strings. That maybe. Should not have tried this on a late on a Friday. Recovered onto a new server on Saturday afternoon. Oh boy.
Oh, that must be stressful.
Yeah. This is where I selfishly say I am glad I'm no longer an admin.
Yeah, among my interview questions, a lesson absolutely learned the hard way. I literally ask in every interview if it's a DBA gig, if they will drop money on calling Microsoft if there is a crisis. That's important for me. You can't just wave a wand and fix things if something goes wrong at that level.
Yeah. And if you think about the amount of downtime and effort required to recover, to just get back to where it was before,
exactly,
that cost is probably greater than the support call cost would have been.
Yeah.
But organizations don't always think in those terms.
No, they don't.
It's easy to think of people as a sunk cost.
Exactly.
So I already have these employees. versus I have to pay $500 or whatever the number is for this support call. 500 is, I think that's a number, but I haven't had to do it myself before. I'm a millennial, so I avoid phones.
You say that for a lot of things, Kevin. I like to avoid phones too. I'm not a millennial.
That's true. That's fair. That's fair. All right. So adding one more thread to all of this, because that's how we roll at Shop Talk. Deeply recursive. DJ asks, what approach do you think will guide us to determine the root cause to find the failover of an always-on availability group? I've used the failover detection utility most of the time, but it never gives the proper reason other than showing the possible error around that time. Interested in finding out what caused the error. This is where having Tracy around would be awesome, because Tracy knows more about availability groups than I do. So
yes, Tracy is very good with that.
Yeah.
But if you want, no, I can take the question back to her. It's not a problem. And I'll copy it out what he said, and we'll have an answer on the next Shop Talk episode, or we'll post on the meetup thing.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
While you do that, I'm gonna give my partial answer, which is generally you'll find some of that information in the SQL Server Error Log. So right before failover happens, if it's a manual failover, you'll see error log entries in SQL Server on your primary node, or whichever node was failed over. So you should see that information. And if it was failed over due to an error, due to server being inaccessible, you would find that on the new machine, the one that was failed over to. So you would see something like TCP connection lost or something along those lines that would say, we lost connectivity to the primary node, but the quorum machine and I, or the other nodes and I, realized that this thing went down, and therefore we've automatically failed over. And if it's manual failover, basically the message is going to say manual failover occurred. And then you would want to look at things like the Windows error log, if you have any sys logs, to give you context around what was happening at that time, or even asking the person, hey, what was happening that caused you to trigger that failover? So that, I think, is probably the best answer I can give off the top of my head. We will come back to Tracy and either talk about it in great detail next week, or at least drop a comment in this week's Shop Talk Meetup post.
I just sent her your question, so when she responds, I will post it there.
Great. And Chris follows up, says, we'll talk to a supervisor about what to do and when to try again. Yeah, best of luck with that. Sorry, there's no really easy answer.
Yeah.
I think it's probably just something funky happening with the server names, where maybe since that says it was SQL Agent and MSDB, it could be that SQL Agent is looking for the machine name, and the machine name is not matching what it's expecting to get, and therefore just blows up.
Sounds like something like that. And yeah.
But, sadly, it's kind of hard to tell. And when it happens in production, you don't have the time to leisurely sit back and think through, well, what are the possible problems? What are the locations of all the possible error logs? And let's peruse these and understand what's happening. Instead, it's bleary-eyed late on Friday night, and you want to go to sleep and can't go to sleep because this thing's still broken. So, completely understand the not only the issue that where you're stuck in, but also that, look, when you just need to get this thing back up, proper forensics just aren't going to happen. So Mike asks, is that different than a resource group? Speaking of resource groups, so I've used Procmon to capture errors that fail to update the registry. Oh, that's an interesting approach to doing it. Yeah. Yeah, I am not good enough with Procmon to be able to do much more than look at it and say, ooh, this has got a lot of stuff, Mark Rusinovich. This has got a lot of stuff. I've used it just enough to say I understand how someone who really knows how to use this can make incredible work of things, but I'm not that person. I wish I were that person. I would need to dedicate myself to be that person. But yeah, that's a cool use of it.
It's a very strong, sysadmin, Windows admin background to make sense of Procmon and use it the right way. I mean, I worked with in my 20 years of my career, I think I worked with 3 people who really knew it.
Right.
Yeah.
And Rusinovich even had, so Mark even had a book, I think it was like literally that thick, of how to use the sysadmin utils.
Right. Yes.
That was the book.
Yes.
I know how to use Zoom It. Just don't have Zoom It installed on this machine. All right. So yeah, getting back to resource groups, all the systems internals tools are great. There's a huge number of them. The ones I have actually worked with, yes, I agree. Mark has done a great job. Clearly,
Mark is a genius.
Yes. And it was a very smart move for Microsoft to say, how much money do you want, Mark Rusinovich? We will buy you out and make these tools official Microsoft tools.
Funny, little bit different is he also wrote a novel, a book of fiction. That's the only one I've read. I haven't read his internal book.
The fictional book is probably a little bit more accessible.
Right.
Yeah, so talking a bit back about resource groups again. Basically, again, general philosophy, a resource group is a thing that connects a set of resources together and that you would delete them all at once. That's the motivation that I have around what resource group should something go into. It's really about when it's time to clean this thing up, which things can I get rid of together? But if you're using one Azure Container Repository for everything, well, it's not going to be that easy. Or you have one Azure Function app that has a lot of different functions that are cross-domain. And so the more interconnected services that you have, the less that one resource group per application actually works in practice. I think there will be some overlap. You're not going to have Azure DevOps per application. You're going to have one Azure DevOps installation, and that's going to be your release management tool. But at the same time, I don't think you need all the resources to be, say, wholly contained within a resource group. There can be interactions across resource groups, but that's where an architect has to look at this and say, well, as we have these interactions, we'd better note them. We'd better mark it down and use some judgment in whether or not I want to have this thing be its own resource group or put it into a different resource group, or have these two things communicate with each other versus spinning up a new one inside the RG. So Mala, Mike is talking about using the sysadmin tools.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, sysinternals toolkit. Like Procmon and Zoomit and those other ones.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And by the way, when I talk about resource groups in this way, I am also assuming that essentially like one subscription per environment. In the AWS world, you may have one subscription per major domain, meaning that I could have 3 or 4 separate prod subscriptions, but you don't have interactions across these across resources in these subscriptions generally. So your subscriptions can get finer grained. In Azure, the subscription itself is intended to be much broader, with the resource group giving you that finer grained control. So I guess my last point on that is service boundaries. Those are your scope. Basically, not necessarily an application. Because like I said, you could have 5 applications that are all tied together because they're part of the same service. You might have a cluster of microservices that are all so dependent on each other that it makes no sense for them to live apart. And in that case, it may make more sense to just have it be one resource group with several app servers, with several databases, with several things happening, as long as at the end of the day, your plan for deprecation is crash the whole thing. And if your service boundary chart's a total mess, resource groups aren't going to help you very much. Doesn't matter how you set them up, because if you've got everything linked together, everything interdependent, deleting anything is going to cause havoc. So that's my 2 cents on resource groups, dragged out over the course of 47 minutes. That's how I roll. Last thing I want to talk about tonight. I'm going to share my screen. So we are going to share screen 3. And do this. So what I have here is a SQL Server instance, got Management Studio, and I am connected to a Scratch database. Now this Scratch database, I already mentioned I don't have Zoom it, so sorry folks. I have an external table called sales.invoice lines. Sales.invoice lines ties to another SQL Server instance that hits wide world importers. And I want to show an error that a person reached out to me about regarding Polybase. So it's a fairly simple setup, just a straight SQL Server to SQL Server connection. And if I query sales.invoice lines, I get back a result. And the process is pretty simple. There's a remote query operation that returns back 1 row. Because what's happening is this query is pushed down to the remote SQL Server instance that returns back a single row, and we report the single row. That's exactly what we want. That is the most optimal scenario. So what happens if I declare a couple variables, minimum quantity and a description? I want to get the total profit from sales invoice lines that had at least 2 in their quantity and are this USB food flash drive chocolate bar. And I'm going to use, first let's run this without option recompile. So I'm going to run this, and what I get is kind of a hot mess. You can notice that it's taking a while to run. That's because it is pulling back 1.75 million rows in order to run a compute scalar operation, just to get the calculation for total profit, and then performing a filter. This is what I'm doing in the where clause. My filter is where quantity is greater than equal to minimum quantity, and description is like convert implicit in varchar 100 description 0. So description, by the way, just to point out, this is not some sort of weird implicit conversion from varchar to in varchar. Description is in varchar 100. So that is the correct data type. This is not, it's not in varchar versus varchar, Unicode versus non-Unicode weirdness. If I use option recompile, I have to run the whole query. I get back the result less time because it pushes down that predicate and it gives me back the one result, the one row, which is the sum of line profits given this quantity, this description. This is the query that I want to run. So first things first, with Polybase, something learned in practice, option recompile is going to be your friend more than it is for regular queries. Second, here's where it gets real interesting. What if, instead of simply returning this number, I populate it in a variable? So total profit equals sum of line profit. And I run this query. The sane among us would say, well, shoot, this is the same thing as before. It's the same thing as above. It should take 1 second and be done. One row affected. Because it pulled back everything, it performed the filter on the local SQL Server instance after pulling 1.75 million rows, and then performed the aggregation here. Yeah, seemed like longer than 1 second. Yes, that was my longer than 1 second scowl. But it's the same query. I used option recompile. That same exact query, like look. But setting this variable somehow made it choke. But wait, there's more. So, declare total profit, and if I try to force external pushdown, I can run this, and it will not return in reasonable time. I consider reasonable time here 1 second, because we got it to return in 1 second. So if I force external pushdown, it laughs at me and says, nope, will not push down. Okay, so what can we do? Well, what if I don't include the description, but force recompile? Let's pretend I didn't do that. Option recompile. It did pull over most of that data, but then it filtered it down quickly. So this is a little different. What if I include the string and force external pushdown? We're still running, by the way. It took 7 seconds. If I option recompile, it's still taking 7 seconds. So it seems like there is a problem in the Polybase engine with respect to strings that in certain circumstances, pushdown does not happen. In the Polybase in SQL Server 2016 that went against Hadoop, specifically Hadoop, because that was the only one you could do predicate pushdown on. Strings were not allowed for predicate pushdown because Java strings and .NET strings are different, and there's case sensitivity issues. There were a bunch of different issues where essentially they said, we're not even going to try to replicate in Java what we're doing here with SQL Server. So if you had a string, that would not get pushed down, and by nature of the way that Polybase would work, essentially it would push down all the predicates that it could within the specific rules that applied. So it could push down integers. It could push down, I think, float. It might have been able to do decimal, but it would not push down binary, would not push down strings, varchar or in varchar. Next interesting bit. The way that I got around this, if you really need this in a variable, create a temp table, load the temp table, and then select the value from the temp table. Notice that this took the 1 second. And by the way, insert into total profit, this is a remote query that has 1 line. So, we're back to having the correct remote query. So it seems like assigning a value to a variable within Polybase when at least hitting SQL Server. It probably also affects other domains as well, but definitely affecting SQL Server. That this can cause your queries to perform a lot worse than you would expect. And the answer number 1, if you don't need to assign the result to a variable, well, use option recompile. And this solution is fast. For some definition of fast. I mean, it would be the same performance on the remote server as well. If you do need to assign to a variable, then load into a temp table, insert into the temp table, query the temp table. It's going to be a little bit slower than your ideal option because you have to take the time to build out that temp table and you're inserting into it and then you're querying from it. So we are adding, I don't know, some number of milliseconds to the total performance, but that's still a lot better than 7 seconds or 8 seconds when you're talking 1.1 versus 1.07 compared to 6 or 7 seconds. I have reported this issue. I don't have a solution for the issue. So be cautious if you're using Polybase. It could be a problem. I'm glad I got that off my chest. That's been sitting for a little while, and I actually need to make a blog post about it because it's annoying. Like, that's the type of thing that you don't find in a unit test. You don't find in an integration test, and you don't find when you're just trying out the product, because who would imagine that when you assign to a variable and you have a string value, that performance would be different than if you weren't assigning to a variable. It just doesn't make any sense. And yet, here we are. So, on that note, we're going to wrap up for this evening.
Yep.
I was just looking to see if there was going to be any last second chat. Normally, when I say that, there's somebody who gets in chat right at that moment. And so I was giving them that pregnant pause to drop something in. But we are going to wrap up for this evening. Tomorrow, we have a really good presentation lined up. So Solomon asks, did it happen when assigning to a variable and not using a string? And the answer was that we did see that the total amount of time that it took was like 2 seconds, but it actually was bringing over all of the data and then filtering that data locally instead of pushing down the predicate as we would have expected. So it did not perform the way that it should have, but it did perform a lot better than the scenario where we were doing a string comparison afterward. So it was like crummy, but not as crummy, if that makes sense. So tomorrow we have got for the main meeting a presentation, Start Thinking Like the SQL Engine. Check that out tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 3:30 Pacific, 23:30 UTC. Mike says, I used to see people stack a bunch of string functions together to do simple movements of bytes with known lengths, and they wonder why things take so long in their code. Yeah. Solomon says, bringing everything back when assigning to a variable makes sense, I think, as the variable can only exist locally. So the problem that I see with that, though, Solomon, is that assignment should be at the end. So you should have a number that is then assigned, and when the variable is a predicate, it can at least be translated and sent as a literal. It's not sending the variable over. Like if I use option recompile, that's how we have those input variables be sent over and successfully understood as their real values. It's when you're taking the result and assigning it to a variable locally, that's the part where I look at that and say, I don't think it makes sense that you would have to behave any differently, because you're essentially performing all the operations, and then as part of the end, you have a compute scalar that assigns that variable. So I mean, I could be wrong in that regard, but it does seem just a little weird that it would behave so radically differently. And yeah, it's a compute scalar at the very end that's going to be that variable assignment. Assigning to a variable works on a row-by-row basis. True, but by the time you get to that assignment, the hash match aggregation or whatever aggregation has already happened. And again, all of this work could be done, like it should be pushed down to the remote server, and the remote server returns its result set. The predicates haven't changed. So the idea that assignment and the select clause would cause a difference is just, it's weird to me. I mean, I know, I get where you're going in terms of trying to understand how it could work that way. I think I would consider that a bug, though. Even if there's a mechanism that explains that, yes, this is how things are understood, I would consider that treatment wrong. It would be easier to explain if you weren't typing. That's fair. That's fair. But all this is still happening at the end of the query. And so I have reported it, haven't heard any news about it, but it was right around the time everybody was going for Christmas. So I may follow up on that and see if anybody on the Polybase team sees that as a problem, or if that is expected behavior. I don't think that could be reasonable expected behaviors. I can understand that it does happen. We saw it, and there therefore is a reason why it happens. But I still would consider that not good behavior. So on that note, we're gonna wrap up for this evening. Stop in tomorrow. Start thinking like the SQL engine, and we'll see you on Shop Talk 2 weeks. Till then, take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.